February 1945. Luzon Island, Philippines. The transport truck rumbled through the mud-slicked roads of central Luzon, its canvas cover flapping in the humid wind. Inside, 14 women sat in silence, their hands bound loosely with rope, their faces streaked with dirt and ash. They wore the tattered remains of Imperial Japanese Army nursing uniforms, once white, now the color of rust and earth. The youngest was 19, the eldest 36. None of them spoke. They did not cry. They had been taught that capture was a fate worse than death, that surrender was the ultimate betrayal of the Emperor, of Japan, of everything they had been raised to believe. And now, as the truck carried them toward an American prisoner of war camp, they waited for what they had been promised would come: humiliation, torture, execution. But what awaited them instead would shatter every certainty they had ever known. The war in the Pacific had reached its final blood-soaked chapter. By early 1945, American forces had reclaimed the Philippines in a campaign that left Manila in ruins and tens of thousands dead. The Japanese 14th Area Army, once a formidable occupation force, had been shattered into desperate fragments scattered across the mountains and jungles of Luzon. Among those fragments were not only soldiers, but also the often forgotten auxiliaries of the imperial war machine: nurses, clerks, comfort station workers, and civilian employees who had followed the Paranon army across the conquered territories of the co-prosperity sphere. As American forces swept through the island, they began to encounter these women, some found hiding in caves, others abandoned by retreating units, a few captured in field hospitals overrun during the American advance. These women had been raised in a culture that defined honor through obedience, sacrifice, and the acceptance of death over disgrace. The concept of surrender was so alien to Imperial Japanese military ideology that official training materials barely addressed it. Instead, soldiers and auxiliaries alike were indoctrinated with stories of American barbarism, tales of prisoners tortured, women violated, corpses desecrated. Japanese propaganda had painted the Americans as demons, as subhuman savages driven by racial hatred and bloodlust. For Japanese women, capture was considered not merely dangerous, but spiritually annihilating. To fall into enemy hands was to become forever tainted, forever lost to the community of the pure. Many had been issued grenades with the implicit understanding that they were to be used on themselves if capture became imminent. And yet, here they were, alive, captured, bound for a fate they could not imagine. The truck slowed and turned through a gate flanked by American sentries. The women did not look up. They kept their eyes down, their breathing shallow. They expected clubs, chains, the rough hands of men who would claim them as spoils. They expected to be stripped, paraded, broken. This was what they had been told. This was what they had been trained to fear. Instead, the truck stopped, and the canvas flap was pulled back by a young American soldier, a corporal, barely 20, with freckles across his sunburned nose. He did not shout. He did not sneer. He simply gestured for them to step down, his voice calm, almost gentle. "Come on out, ladies, slowly. No one's going to hurt you." The women did not move. They did not understand his words, but they understood his tone. It confused them. It frightened them more than violence would have. One of the older women, a former nursing supervisor named Takahashi Fumiko, finally rose and stepped toward the tailgate. She moved slowly, waiting for the blow. It did not come. The soldier offered his hand to help her down. She stared at it as if it were a snake. Then, carefully, she ignored it and climbed down on her own. The others followed. They were led into a compound surrounded by barbed wire, but the wire faced outward, not inward. Inside were rows of tents and prefabricated barracks. There were latrines, a mess hall, a medical station. Everything was orderly, clean, organized. The women were brought to a processing area where American officers, some men, some women in U.S. Army Nurse Corps uniforms, waited with clipboards and forms. An interpreter stepped forward, a Nisei corporal from Hawaii, and spoke to them in Japanese. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the United States military. You will not be harmed. You will be given food, water, shelter, and medical care. You will be treated in accordance with international law." The women did not believe him. How could they? Everything they had ever been told about the Americans contradicted this. They stood in silence, waiting for the lie to reveal itself. But the lie never came. To understand the shock these women experienced, one must first understand the world they came from. Imperial Japan in the early 20th century was a society built upon rigid hierarchies of gender, age, and class. Women occupied a carefully defined space within that hierarchy, a space that granted them honor and purpose only insofar as they supported the male-dominated structures of family, community, and state. The concept of Ryosai Kenbo, good wife, wise mother, had been the guiding ideal of female education since the Meiji era. Women were to be obedient, self-sacrificing, and dedicated to the reproduction and upbringing of future citizens and soldiers. Their worth was measured by their ability to serve. When war came, this ideology did not change, it merely expanded. Women were mobilized to support the war effort in roles deemed appropriate to their nature, as nurses, as factory workers, as agricultural laborers, as comfort women coerced into sexual slavery to service the troops. Those who served close to the front lines, such as military nurses, occupied a unique position. They were honored for their sacrifice, yet also reminded constantly of their subordinate status. They were not soldiers. They could not be. To be a soldier was to be a man. Women could serve, suffer, and die, but they could not claim the honor of combat. And if they were captured, they were told they would suffer fates too horrible to name. American propaganda, as filtered through Japanese military channels, only reinforced these fears. Japanese soldiers were shown photographs, some real, most fabricated, of alleged American atrocities. Stories circulated of prisoners executed en masse, of wounded men left to die in the sun, of women dragged into barracks and gang-raped by entire companies. These stories were believed not because they were true, but because they fit within the existing framework of how Japanese military culture understood the enemy. The Americans were depicted as racially inferior, morally degenerate, and incapable of the discipline and honor that defined the Japanese warrior spirit. To surrender to such creatures was unthinkable. And so, when Japanese women found themselves in American custody, they carried with them an almost paralyzing dread. They expected violation, they expected death. What they did not expect, what they could not have been prepared for, was respect. The first meal was served at 1800 hours. The women were brought to a mess tent and seated at long tables. Before them, American soldiers placed metal trays divided into compartments. Into those compartments went portions of food that seemed, to the starving women, almost obscene in their abundance. White rice, canned vegetables, beef stew, bread with butter, canned peaches in, syrup, and coffee. Real coffee, not the burnt barley substitute they had choked down for years. The portions were not meager. They were not spoiled. They were hot, plentiful, and served without ceremony. Takahashi Fumiko stared at the tray in front of her. She had not seen this much food in one place in over a year. During the final months of the Philippine campaign, Japanese forces had been cut off from supply lines, reduced to foraging, to eating grass and roots, and, in the worst cases, to darker measures. Whispered about, but never spoken aloud. She had watched soldiers die of starvation, their bodies shrunk into skeletons, their eyes glazed with the madness of hunger. She had rationed her own meals down to a handful of rice per day, telling herself that this was sacrifice, that this was duty, that this was what the emperor required. Now, here was a tray of food given to her by the enemy. Given, not sold. Given, not earned. Given freely, as if she were a human being deserving of nourishment. She did not touch it at first. None of the women did. They sat in silence, staring at the trays, waiting for the trick to reveal itself. Perhaps the food was poisoned. Perhaps it was a test, a way to identify the weak, the ones who would break. Perhaps the Americans were simply fattening them up before the real punishment began. An American officer, a captain in the nurse corps, walked slowly to the tent. She was tall, blonde, and she moved with a confidence that the Japanese women found both alien and unsettling. She stopped beside Takahashi's table and spoke through the interpreter. "You need to eat. You're malnourished. Some of you have dysentery, beriberi, infections. If you don't eat, you won't recover. This isn't a trick. It's just food." Takahashi looked up at her. The American woman's face was calm, serious, but not unkind. There was no cruelty in her eyes, no mockery, no superiority. She looked at Takahashi the way one medical professional looks at another, with a shared understanding of what suffering looks like and what must be done to alleviate it. Slowly, Takahashi picked up the fork. She took a small bite of the rice. It was real. It was warm. It tasted like rice was supposed to taste clean, filling, life-giving. She swallowed. Then she took another bite. Around her, the other women began to eat. Some wept quietly as they did so. Others simply stared ahead, their faces blank, their minds struggling to reconcile what they were experiencing with everything they had been taught to believe. That first meal became a symbol. It was the first crack in the wall of lies they had been fed. It was the first piece of evidence that perhaps, just perhaps, they had been wrong about the Americans. In the days that followed, the women were processed through a routine that seemed almost incomprehensible in its bureaucratic normalcy. They were photographed, fingerprinted, and interviewed. They were given physical examinations by female medical staff who treated their wounds, their infections, their malnutrition with the same clinical detachment they would have shown to American patients. They were issued clean uniforms, simple cotton blouses and trousers, not marked with any degrading symbols, not designed to humiliate. They were assigned barracks with cots, blankets, and mosquito netting. They were given soap, toothbrushes, sanitary napkins. These small dignities, these ordinary provisions, struck them with the force of revelation. One woman, a 22-year-old nurse named Sato Kaiko, later wrote in her diary an account that would be preserved and translated after the war, that she could not understand why the Americans were being kind. The word itself seemed wrong to her. Kindness implied a relationship between equals, or between a superior and an inferior whom the superior chose to treat well. But the Americans were enemies. They were supposed to hate her. They were supposed to want revenge for Pearl Harbor, for Bataan, for all the blood that had been spilled across the Pacific, and yet they gave her a toothbrush. They treated her infected foot. They did not touch her except in the context of medical care. And even then, they asked permission first. This asking of permission was perhaps the most disorienting aspect of all. In the Japanese military system, orders were given and obeyed without question. Personal autonomy, especially for women, was subsumed entirely into the needs of the hierarchy. But here, in this American camp, the doctors and nurses asked before they examined a wound. They explained what they were doing and why. They offered choices. Do you want hot tea or cold water? Do you want to rest in the barracks or sit outside? These were trivial choices, meaningless in the grand scheme of war, but to the women who had never been granted even the illusion of agency, they were extraordinary. Takahashi Fumiko found herself thinking about a phrase she had heard once in a propaganda film shown to nursing students back in Tokyo. The Americans have no discipline. They are soft, weak, ruled by sentiment rather than duty. At the time, she had believed it. She had pitied the Americans for their lack of rigor, their inability to sacrifice properly. But now, watching American soldiers and nurses go about their work efficient, organized, professional, she realized that she had mistaken humanity for weakness. The Americans were not soft. They were not weak. They were simply operating under a different set of principles that did not require cruelty to function. This realization came slowly in fragments over the course of weeks. It came in the way an American guard shared his cigarettes with a Japanese prisoner who asked for one. It came in the way the nurses set up a small library in the camp and allowed the prisoners to borrow books, in English, yes, but also a few Japanese novels and magazines that had been confiscated from other camps and redistributed. It came in the way the Americans celebrated their own holidays. Easter came in early April that year and included the prisoners in the festivities, offering them colored eggs and extra rations of sweets. These gestures were small, almost trivial, but they accumulated. They formed a pattern, and the pattern was this. The Americans treated their prisoners not as animals, not as subhumans, but as people who had simply been on the wrong side of a war. The concept of the Geneva Conventions was entirely foreign to most Japanese military personnel, including the nurses. Japan had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention, but had never ratified it, and in practice, the Japanese military largely ignored its provisions. Japanese soldiers were taught that surrender was dishonorable, and that prisoners, whether Japanese or enemy, had forfeited their rights by failing to die in combat. This ideology had catastrophic consequences throughout the Pacific War. Allied prisoners of war held by Japan suffered some of the worst treatment in modern military history: starvation rations, forced labor, medical neglect, summary executions, and systematic brutality. The death rate among Allied POWs in Japanese custody was approximately 27%, compared to less than 4% for Allied POWs held by Germany. Japanese soldiers believed they were treating prisoners as those prisoners deserved, as disgraced weaklings who had chosen shame over death. But the American military operated under a fundamentally different philosophy. The United States had ratified the Geneva Conventions and, despite inevitable lapses and abuses, made genuine efforts to adhere to them. American military law required that prisoners of war be treated humanely, provided with adequate food, shelter, and medical care, and protected from violence and degradation. This was not purely a matter of morality. It was also pragmatic. Treating prisoners well encouraged surrender, which saved American lives. It maintained discipline among American troops, reducing the likelihood of war crimes and atrocities, and it upheld American ideals, the notion that even in war, certain principles of human dignity were inviolable. For the Japanese women in the camp, this philosophy manifested in 100 small ways. They were not beaten for minor infractions. They were not forced to bow to their captors or perform rituals of abasement. They were not starved or worked to death. They were, in fact, barely required to work at all. Some women volunteered to help in the camp kitchen or laundry, and they were allowed to do so. But they were paid for their labor, paid in scrip that could be used at the camp canteen to buy small luxuries like candy, soap, or writing paper. The idea that they could earn money, that they could make purchases, that they could exercise even this limited form of economic agency was almost incomprehensible. One afternoon in late March, a shipment of Red Cross parcels arrived at the camp. These parcels, assembled by the American Red Cross and intended for prisoners of war, contained items like canned meat, chocolate, cigarettes, playing cards, and toiletries. According to the regulations, they were to be distributed to all prisoners regardless of nationality, and so each of the Japanese women received a parcel. They opened them in stunned silence, pulling out cans of Spam, bars of Hershey's chocolate, packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes. These were not military rations. These were gifts from American civilians, people who had no personal connection to the prisoners, who had simply donated these items out of a sense of humanitarian obligation. Sato Keiko held a chocolate bar in her hands and began to cry. She could not explain why. Later, she would write in her diary that it was not the chocolate itself that moved her, but what it represented. The idea that somewhere in America, a woman, perhaps a mother, perhaps a schoolgirl, had packed this parcel, had included this chocolate, had thought about the person who would receive it, even if that person was an enemy. It was an act of grace that made no sense within the framework of total war, and yet here it was, solid and real in her hands. As the weeks turned into months, the psychological transformation among the women deepened. They began to ask questions, tentative at first, then more boldly, about America, about democracy, about the lives of American women. The interpreter, the Nisei corporal from Hawaii, became a bridge between worlds. His name was Takeshi Yamada, and he had been born in Honolulu to Japanese immigrant parents. He had grown up speaking both Japanese and English, eating rice and hamburgers, celebrating Obon and the 4th of July. To the female prisoners, he was a paradox. A man with a Japanese face and a Japanese name who wore an American uniform and spoke of America as home. Through him, they learned things that astonished them. They learned that American women could vote, that they could own property, that they could attend universities and pursue careers. They learned that in America, women could choose whom to marry, could divorce if they wished, could walk freely in public without male chaperones. These facts seemed almost fantastical, like descriptions of a utopia that could not possibly exist. And yet, Corporal Yamada insisted they were true. He showed them American magazines, Life, Look, the Saturday Evening Post, filled with photographs of American women in trousers, driving cars, working in factories, laughing with men in casual, easy camaraderie. The women studied these images with the intensity of archaeologists examining artifacts from an alien civilization. Takahashi Fumiko found herself particularly drawn to a photograph in a copy of Life magazine from 1944. It showed a female aircraft worker, a riveter, standing in front of a B-24 Liberator bomber. The woman wore coveralls and a bandana, and she held a rivet gun with confident ease. Her expression was serious, focused, professional. The caption read, "Women in War Work, the Arsenal of Democracy." Takahashi stared at this photograph for a long time. In Japan, women had been mobilized for war work as well, but always in roles defined as auxiliary, as supportive. They were praised for their sacrifice, but never for their skill, never for their strength. This American woman, though she looked like a craftsman, a builder, a creator of the machines that had destroyed the Japanese war effort. She looked, in a word, powerful. "Is this real?" Takahashi asked Corporal Yamada. "Do American women really do this kind of work?" "Yes," he said, "millions of them. While the men went to fight, women built the planes, the ships, the tanks. They kept the factories running. They kept the country running." Takahashi was silent for a moment. Then she said, "In Japan, we were told that American women were weak, that they were spoiled and lazy, that they cared only for fashion and movies." Yamada smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Propaganda," he said. "Both sides told lies about the other. That's how war works." This conversation, and others like it, planted seeds of doubt that grew into something larger, a questioning of the entire narrative structure upon which these women's lives had been built. If they had been lied to about American women, what else had they been lied to about? If the Americans were not demons, not savages, not racial inferiors, then what did that mean about the war itself? What did that mean about the sacrifices they had made, the suffering they had endured, the belief system they had dedicated themselves to? These were dangerous questions. To ask them was to risk a kind of psychological collapse, a shattering of identity. And yet, the questions would not go away. They were there in every meal served without cruelty, in every medical treatment given without sadism, in every interaction that revealed the Americans to be not monsters but merely human beings, trying to do their jobs in the midst of a terrible war. In May 1945, the war in Europe ended. News of Germany's surrender reached the camp, and the American soldiers celebrated with restrained relief. The Japanese women watched these celebrations with mixed feelings. On one hand, they understood that the end of the European war meant that America could now focus all its resources on the Pacific, which made Japan's defeat all but certain. On the other hand, they saw in the Americans' joy not bloodlust or triumphalism, but simple exhaustion and gratitude, that at least part of the nightmare was over. The American soldiers did not gloat. They did not parade in front of the prisoners and mock them. They simply shared cigarettes, played music on a crackling radio, and talked quietly about going home. One evening, a group of American soldiers set up a makeshift movie screen in the camp and showed a film Hollywood musical. Something light and frivolous, designed to distract and entertain. The Japanese women were invited to watch. Most of them came more out of curiosity than interest. They sat on benches at the back, separated from the American soldiers by an invisible but palpable barrier of language and culture. The film was in English, which most of them did not understand, but the music was universal, and the images on the screen, men and women dancing, singing, laughing, painted a picture of a world so far removed from the brutal reality of war that it seemed almost obscene. Sato Keiko watched the film with a kind of hungry fascination. She had never seen a Hollywood movie before. In Japan, such films had been banned as decadent Western propaganda. But now, watching the dancers twirl across the screen, watching the characters fall in love and solve their trivial problems with songs and smiles, she felt a longing so intense it was almost painful. This was the world the Americans came from. This was the world they were fighting to preserve. It was a world where people could afford to be frivolous, where life was not solely about duty and sacrifice and death. It was a world where joy was possible. When the film ended, the American soldiers applauded and began to file out. One of them, a young private, noticed Keiko still sitting, staring at the blank screen. He approached her and, through gestures and broken phrases, asked if she had enjoyed the film. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He smiled, gave her a thumbs up, and walked away. It was a small interaction, meaningless in itself, but it stayed with her. He had treated her not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as another person who had just watched a movie. It was a moment of ordinary human connection, and it broke something inside her, some last wall of resistance, some final refusal to accept that the Americans were, in fact, exactly what they appeared to be: ordinary people living in a society that valued, at least in theory, the dignity and autonomy of the individual. The symbolic object that would come to represent this transformation was not a weapon, not a flag, but something far simpler: the apple. In early June, a shipment of fresh fruit arrived at the camp: apples, oranges, and bananas. Luxuries that had been almost unobtainable in wartime Japan, even before the blockade and the collapse of supply lines. The apples were American, grown in Washington state, and they were distributed to both the American personnel and the prisoners. Each woman received one apple. They were large, red, unblemished, perfect. Takahashi Fumiko held her apple and turned it over in her hands. She had not seen fresh fruit like this in years. And Japan, by 1945, the civilian diet had been reduced to a bare subsistence level. People ate sweet potatoes, radish greens, rice mixed with sawdust, anything to fill the stomach. Fresh fruit was a distant memory, a luxury from a time before the war had consumed everything. And here in a prisoner of war camp in the Philippines, she had been given an apple, not a rotten apple, not a bruised apple, but a perfect apple, as if she were a guest at a banquet rather than a captive of war. She bit into it. The flesh was crisp, sweet, and so full of juice that it ran down her chin. She closed her eyes and, for a moment, forgot where she was. The taste of the apple was a taste of abundance, of a world where there was enough food, enough resources, enough humanity to go around. It was the taste of a society that could afford to feed its prisoners fresh fruit, not because it had to, but because it believed that even prisoners deserved to be treated as human beings. The apple became a symbol among the women. They talked about it in the evenings, sitting in their barracks, whispering in Japanese so the guards would not understand. They compared it to the meals they had eaten in Japan, to the shortages, to the propaganda that had told them that Japan was winning the war even as people starved in the streets of Tokyo. They began to understand in a way that no amount of propaganda could have reversed, that they had been on the losing side, not because the Japanese were weaker or less brave, but because they had been fighting an enemy with resources so vast, so overwhelming, that it could afford to give apples to its prisoners. This realization was humbling, even humiliating. It forced them to confront the lies they had been told and the lies they had told themselves. But it also offered a strange kind of comfort. If Japan had lost because America was simply too strong, too rich, too organizationally superior, then perhaps the loss was not a moral failing. Perhaps it was simply the inevitable result of a mismatch in industrial capacity and resources. Perhaps they could surrender their belief in the invincibility of the emperor and the superiority of the Yamato spirit without surrendering their sense of self-worth. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The news reached the camp within days, carried by radio broadcasts and whispered rumors. The Japanese women learned that their homeland had been struck by a weapon beyond comprehension, a weapon that had killed tens of thousands in an instant and left the cities in ruins. They learned that the Soviet Union had entered the war, invading Manchuria and sweeping aside the Kwantung Army. They learned that Japan was on the brink of collapse. And then, on August 15, 1945, they learned that the emperor had surrendered. The announcement was made over the camp's public address system, translated into Japanese by Corporal Yamada. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of emotion in it, relief, sorrow, something too complex to name. He read the emperor's surrender speech, the words that millions of Japanese were hearing at that same moment. Words that spoke of enduring the unendurable and bearing the unbearable. When he finished, there was silence. The American soldiers did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They simply stood and waited, respecting the gravity of the moment. In the women's barracks, there was weeping, not the loud, cathartic weeping of grief, but the quiet, broken weeping of those who have lost something foundational. The war was over. Japan had lost. The emperor, the living god, had admitted defeat. Everything they had believed, everything they had sacrificed for, had been for nothing. Takahashi Fumiko did not weep. She sat on her cot, staring at the wall, her mind numb. She thought about the soldiers she had nursed, the ones who had died in agony from infected wounds, from starvation, from despair. She thought about the cities she had left behind, the families who had sent their sons and husbands to die for the emperor. She thought about the children who would grow up in a defeated, occupied Japan, who would learn a new history, a new way of being, and she thought about the apple. That perfect red American apple. It had been a gift from the enemy, a gesture of humanity from a nation that could have chosen cruelty instead. And in that moment, she understood that the war had not been lost because Japan lacked courage or spirit. It had been lost because Japan had been fighting a nation that did not need to dehumanize its enemies to defeat them. A nation that believed, however imperfectly, that even in war some things were sacred. In the months after the surrender, the women were gradually repatriated to Japan. They boarded American transport ships that carried them across the Pacific, back to a homeland they no longer recognized. Japan was in ruined, cities flattened by firebombing, the economy shattered, the population traumatized and starving. American occupation forces were already in place, beginning the process of rebuilding and reformation that would transform Japan from a militaristic empire into a pacifist democracy. For the women who had been prisoners, the return was profoundly disorienting. They had left a Japan that believed in its own invincibility and returned to a Japan that had been forced to confront its mortality. They had experienced a strange interlude in which they had been treated with a dignity and respect they had never known in their own country, and now they had to navigate a society that did not know how to process their stories. Many of them never spoke publicly about their time in American custody. To do so would have been to admit that the enemy had been more humane than their own leaders, and that was a truth too painful and too dangerous to voice in the early post-war years. But in private, in letters and diaries and conversations with family, they spoke of the apples. They spoke of the nurses who had treated their wounds. They spoke of the soldiers who had shared cigarettes and shown them photographs of their wives and children. They spoke of the moment they realized that the Americans were not demons but people who came from a society that valued, at least in principle, the idea that all human beings possessed inherent worth. Takahashi Fumiko returned to Tokyo and found her family's home reduced to ash. She worked as a nurse in an American military hospital during the occupation, where she was paid a fair wage and treated as a professional. She watched as the occupation authorities introduced reforms that gave women the right to vote, the right to own property, the right to divorce. She watched as young Japanese girls went to school alongside boys, as women began to enter universities and professions that had been closed to them before, and she thought about the photograph she had seen in that American magazine. The woman in coveralls, holding a rivet gun, building the machines that had won the war. She thought about what it meant to live in a society where a woman could be valued not just for her ability to serve, but for her ability to create, to decide, to be. Years later, in the 1970s, when Japanese historians began to collect oral testimonies from survivors of the war, Takahashi agreed to be interviewed. She was in her 60s then, a grandmother, a respected member of her community. She spoke carefully, choosing her words with precision. She described the moment she first arrived at the American camp, the fear she had felt, the certainty that she would be brutalized, and then she described the apple. The perfect red American apple. She said that it had taught her something she had never been taught in Japan, that abundance and humanity could coexist, that a strong nation did not need to be a cruel nation, that power and compassion were not contradictory. "I do not say that the Americans were perfect," she said in that interview, her voice steady and clear. "I do not say that there were no crimes, no abuses. War is war, and terrible things happen. But I will say this. They treated us as if we were human beings. They fed us when we were starving. They healed us when we were sick. They gave us apples, and in doing so, they showed us that the world we had been taught to believe, in a world where strength required cruelty, where honor required death, was not the only world possible. There was another world, a world where even your enemy could be treated with dignity. In that world, that possibility changed everything. The story of the female Japanese prisoners in the Philippines is not widely known. It does not fit neatly into the grand narratives of the Pacific War, which tend to focus on battles, campaigns, and the dramatic turning points of history. But it is a story that reveals something essential about the nature of ideology and the power of experience to transform it. These women had been raised in a system that defined their worth through obedience and sacrifice, that taught them to expect brutality from their enemies, that promised them honor only in death, and them through the simple, mundane acts of their captors feeding them, healing them, treating them with basic respect. They were forced to confront the possibility that everything they had been taught was wrong. This confrontation was not easy. It was not a simple matter of seeing the truth and accepting it. It was a slow, painful process of unlearning, of rebuilding their understanding of the world from the ground up. It required them to acknowledge that their own leaders had lied to them, that the sacrifices they had made had been in service of a cause that was both doomed and morally bankrupt. It required them to accept that the enemy they had feared and hated was, in many ways, more humane than the society they had come from, but it also offered them something invaluable: the possibility of redemption, not in the religious sense, but in the human sense. By being treated as human beings, they were able to reclaim their humanity. By being fed, healed, and respected, they were able to see themselves not as failures, not as traitors, but as survivors of a system that had used them and discarded them. And by witnessing the principles that the Americans claimed to uphold, however imperfectly those principles were practiced, they were able to imagine a different kind of society. A society where women could be equals, where individuals had rights, where abundance was not hoarded but shared. The apple was the symbol of all this. It was a small thing, a piece of fruit, nothing more, but it carried within it the weight of a worldview. It said, "We have enough. We do not need to starve you to defeat you. We do not need to dehumanize you to prove our superiority. We can afford to be generous because our strength does not come from cruelty but from the productive capacity of a free society." The apple was a distillation of the American ideal, the idea that liberty and prosperity were linked, that a nation built on the principles of democracy and individual rights would naturally produce abundance, and that this abundance could be extended even to those who had been enemies. Of course, the reality was more complex. The United States in 1945 was far from the ideal society its propaganda suggested. It was a nation still scarred by racism, still struggling with the contradiction between its founding ideals and the reality of segregation, discrimination, and inequality. Japanese Americans had been interned in camps on the West Coast, stripped of their rights and their property, treated as potential traitors simply because of their ancestry. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, many of them women and children, in an instant. The American military had committed atrocities of its own during the Pacific War massacres, rapes, mutilations. The narrative of American moral superiority was, in many ways, a fiction. But for the Japanese women in that camp, the fiction was more humane than the reality they had come from. The gap between American ideals and American practice was still narrower than the gap between Japanese propaganda and Japanese practice. The Americans at least aspired to principles of human dignity and individual rights, even if they often failed to live up to them. Japan, by contrast, had built its entire wartime ideology on the rejection of those principles, on the belief that the individual existed only to serve the state, that suffering was noble, that death was preferable to dishonor. And so, when the women were given apples, when they were treated as equals, they experienced something that felt like liberation. It was not the liberation of victory, because they had lost the war. It was not the liberation of escape, because they were still prisoners. It was the liberation of understanding, the realization that they did not have to accept the version of the world they had been given, that another world was possible, and that they could choose to live in it. Epilogue. War is a crucible in which ideologies are tested. It strips away the rhetoric, the propaganda, the comforting lies, and reveals the raw truth of what a society values. The Pacific War was fought between two vastly different ideologies, one that elevated the collective over the individual, that demanded absolute obedience and self-sacrifice, that promised honor in death, and another that, however imperfectly, claimed to value individual liberty, human dignity, and the right to pursue happiness. The women who were captured by American forces in the Philippines experienced both ideologies firsthand. They lived under the Japanese system, and then they lived, briefly, under the American one. And in the gap between those two experiences, they discovered something that no amount of propaganda could have taught them: that the measure of a society is not how it treats its heroes, but how it treats its defeated enemies. The apples they were given were not gestures of weakness. They were affirmations of strength, the strength that comes from abundance, from confidence, from the belief that one's values can withstand the test of generosity. The Americans did not need to brutalize their prisoners to prove their superiority. They proved it by feeding them, healing them, treating them as human beings. In doing so, they won a victory far more profound than any battlefield triumph. They won the war for the hearts and minds of those who had been their enemies. This is the truth that the Japanese women carried with them when they returned to Japan. This is the truth that shaped the post-war world, that allowed Japan to transform from an enemy into an ally, from a militaristic empire into a pacifist democracy. It is the truth that democracy, for all its flaws and failures, offers something that authoritarianism cannot: the possibility of seeing the humanity in the other, even in the midst of war, the possibility of choosing compassion over cruelty, abundance over scarcity, equality over hierarchy. The apple was real. The kindness was real. And because they were real, they changed the world. In the end, that is the legacy of those 14 women who rode in a truck through the mud of Luzon, waiting for the torture that never came. They learned that freedom is not just the absence of chains, but the presence of dignity. They learned that abundance is not just material wealth, but the generosity of spirit that allows a society to share what it has, even with its enemies. They learned that equality is not just a word, but a lived reality that transforms every interaction, every meal, every small act of respect. They learned, in short, what it means to be treated as human. And once you have learned that, you can never go back to believing that you are anything less.